He was one of the most respected scientists in England, a man who spent his life challenging any belief in God with his unshakable logic. But that day, in the auditorium of the University of Cambridge, he didn't expect to be questioned, let alone silenced, by a boy only 6 years old. Youssef, a Muslim child with attentive eyes and unwavering faith, was about to show that truth, when it comes from the heart, needs no titles or degrees to shake the pillars of arrogance. The audience, made up of doctors, scholars, and students of the most complex sciences, fell into complete silence. A scientist, used to destroying arguments with irony and precision, was confronted by a child and had no answer. And what did Youssef do to disarm a man with decades of experience? Just one question, as simple as it was devastating, that made the whole room understand that reason without humility is just pride in disguise. Youssef was only 6 years old, but in his eyes was a lucidity that unsettled even adults. The son of Algerian immigrants, he was born in Leicester, UK, and grew up between Fajr prayers and the spiritual conversations his grandfather led after Maghrib. He was an ordinary child in many ways. He liked playing with stones, drawing planets, and mimicking the call to prayer with a high-pitched but determined voice. But there was something about him that stood out. His curiosity was sharp as a blade, and his faith solid as a rock. His parents always valued knowledge, both religious and academic. While other boys his age were learning the names of superheroes, Youssef was reciting surahs from the Quran with impressive seriousness, and when he asked questions, it wasn't just for the sake of asking. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know why the sky was blue, why humans doubted what they couldn't see, and why some adults spoke of God as if he were just an outdated fairy tale. It was this search for answers that led his father to register him to attend a public lecture at the University of Cambridge. The event advertised a debate between science and religion, headlined by Dr. Jonathan Blake, a devout atheist known for his harsh stance against any form of faith. The auditorium was packed with students, curious onlookers, and professors eager to watch him dismantle once again any attempt to bring God into the discussion. Youssef sat in the third row, legs swinging back and forth, tightly holding the book his grandfather had given him, Tawheed for Children, with simple but deep illustrations. He wasn't there to confront anyone, but he wouldn't lower his eyes in the face of arrogance either. What no one expected was that the afternoon would not end with applause for the scientist, but with uncomfortable silence, deep reflection, and a child's voice remembered for a long time. Dr. Jonathan Blake was known for his sharp lectures, witty lines, and unshakable stance at any mention of the divine. That afternoon in Cambridge, with a full auditorium, he was no different. He began his speech with a sarcastic tone, saying that faith was an emotional crutch for those still afraid of the dark. The audience laughed. He enjoyed that, controlling the room, commanding attention, guiding others' reasoning with his logic, like a conductor leading an orchestra of skeptics. For nearly an hour he presented charts, theories, and arguments against the existence of a creator. He claimed the universe was a product of chance, that humans projected the idea of God out of insecurity, and that there wasn't a single piece of scientific evidence to support any kind of faith. At one point, as he often did, he issued an open challenge. If there is a God, why can't anyone prove it right here and now? Show me something, anything, that I can measure, weigh, or replicate in a lab, and maybe I'll reconsider my position. Silence fell. The adults glanced at each other, lacking the courage or willingness to confront such a well-prepared man. That's when a small hand was raised. Dr. Blake looked over, surprised, and let out a slight chuckle when he saw it came from a child. "Yes, little scientist, you want to show me God?" he mocked. Youssef stood up calmly. There was something in his gaze that didn't match his age. He didn't tremble, didn't hesitate. He simply responded, "Do you have a brain, doctor?" The question, spoken with innocence and firmness, cut through the air. The audience stirred. The scientist furrowed his brow, trying to decide whether it was a trap or just childish naivety. "Of course I do," he replied, smiling smugly. Youssef then fired back, "But I can't see it. I can't touch it. I can't prove it here. And yet, you believe it exists." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was revealing. And there, in front of a crowd, academic arrogance was challenged by a logic as simple as it was unshakable. For a few seconds, no one knew how to react. The laughter stopped. The eyes, once full of admiration for the scientist, now turned to Youssef, not with pity or condescension, but with a rare kind of respect. A 6-year-old child had done what no adult dared to. He held up a mirror to pride. Dr. Blake, for his part, tried to keep his composure. He cleared his throat, adjusted the microphone and let out a forced chuckle. But his voice no longer carried the same strength. He said something about epistemological categories, but it came off as too technical, almost as if he were trying to dodge the central point, because deep down he knew he had been caught in his own trap. Youssef, meanwhile, remained standing. He said nothing else. He didn't smile, he didn't provoke. He simply looked at the professor with a serenity that dismantled any intellectual shield. The contrast was stark. On one side, a man with decades of study trying to regain control. On the other, a child with unshakable faith and no need to prove anything beyond the obvious. A young woman in the 5th row murmured, "That was brilliant." A philosophy professor crossed his arms, nodding slowly, as if he had just witnessed something rare. And a student near the exit discreetly lifted his phone to record, perhaps realizing that this moment would be remembered for a long time. The scientist tried to change the subject. He moved on to the next slide in his presentation, but the atmosphere in the room had already shifted. Intellectual authority had been displaced. The center of attention was no longer the speaker. It was the 6-year-old boy who dared to ask what no one else had the courage to say. For 1 second, maybe 2, everything stopped. Not even the air seemed to move inside the University of Cambridge auditorium. The scientist, who minutes earlier had the audience laughing with his skeptical remarks, was now facing a boy with a calm face and steady eyes. And for the first time, he didn't have a ready answer. Dr. Blake chuckled briefly, more to himself than to the crowd. He tried to recover. He said something about empirical methods, about metaphysics and neurology. But his voice, once full of authority, now sounded hesitant. The complex terms he used only highlighted what everyone had already noticed. He was evading the point. In the 3rd row, Youssef remained standing. He said no more, just stared, without arrogance, without sarcasm, just the calm of someone who knew he had said what mattered and didn't need anything else. The audience's reaction was subtle, but powerful. A theology professor in the back let out a quiet, "Subhanallah." A student who had been taking notes stopped, closed his notebook and stared at the scientist like someone losing admiration for an idol. Even the sound technician, who had been distracted until then, looked up at the stage, sensing that something far greater than an intellectual debate had just occurred. Dr. Blake tried to regain control. He moved to the next slide, returned to his script, but the audience didn't follow him. All faces were turned toward Youssef. The moment had already been captured, not by cameras but by the memories of everyone present. And in that instant, no one remembered the thesis being presented, only the question, and the one who had the courage to ask it. Cambridge, long used to producing geniuses, was now witnessing a lesson from the most unexpected place. It wasn't logic versus logic. It was pride versus purity. And pride lost. To many, that question seemed to have been born in the heat of the moment. But what few knew was that the phrase that silenced the scientist had been planted weeks earlier, in a simple conversation between grandfather and grandson in a modest mosque in the Highfields neighborhood of Leicester. That morning, Youssef sat cross-legged on the blue carpet, watching his grandfather arrange books. He used to do that after Fajr, read a verse from the Quran, share a reflection, then tell old stories. But that day, the old imam spoke differently. "Youssef, did you know there are very intelligent people who say God doesn't exist?" The boy, curious as always, furrowed his brow. "But how do they think then? They say they only believe in what they can see, touch, or prove with machines. They only believe in what science can measure." Youssef stayed quiet for a while. Then he answered, not knowing that his words would one day cross the walls of that mosque and echo through the halls of one of the world's most prestigious universities. "But no one's ever seen their own brain. Right, Jiddo?" The grandfather smiled, not out of mockery, but out of admiration, because within that childlike simplicity lived one of the deepest truths about human limitation. Not everything that is real can be touched. Not everything invisible is false. And not every absence of proof is proof of absence. From that day on, Youssef kept that logic in his heart, not to challenge anyone, but to remind himself that his faith was just as legitimate as any equation. When his father decided to take him to Dr. Blake's lecture, it was more out of cultural curiosity than belief in a debate. They never imagined that the calm, observant boy would get a chance to speak, and that when he did, he would carry not just a question, but the voice of generations that never had the space to speak of God in places where he had been silenced. Youssef didn't plan to confront, but when the moment came, he simply said what he already knew. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be spoken. Dr. Blake kept talking, but anyone paying attention would see the signs. Fingers tapping on the podium, uneven breathing, eyes that no longer looked directly at the audience. He was no longer facing a child. He was facing something far more dangerous to human pride, the mirror of his own limitation. For decades, he had prided himself on his ability to dismantle beliefs with clarity. In his books, he argued that faith was an emotional crutch for the weak. In his lectures, he made jokes about sacred texts, calling them ancient myths. And on that stage, he carried over 30 years of career as a scientific authority. But now all of it seemed useless before the simplicity of a child's question. Youssef didn't humiliate him, and that was exactly what hurt the most, because there was no attack, no irony, no attempt to win, only truth. And truth, when it comes like that, bare and effortless, hurts more than any offensive argument. Inside, the scientist relived an old conflict. Forgotten memories came back. His grandmother, praying silently before meals. Childhood, when he still asked if God could hear thoughts. The fear of death, which he had replaced with theories. And now a child with steady eyes and a clear voice reopened it all, unknowingly. Dr. Blake looked at the clock. He was ahead of schedule, but decided to end there. He thanked the audience, the academic committee, and said he would open the floor for questions. But no one else wanted to ask anything. The mood had shifted, the authority had dissolved, and he knew it. When he sat at the table next to the other speakers, he didn't hear the comments around him. He could only think about how that boy's faith had become more unsettling than any debate with seasoned theologians or religious scholars. Because Youssef hadn't tried to prove anything. He hadn't debated. He had simply believed, and that, for a man like Blake, was the kind of certainty science could never measure. That night when he got home, the scientist didn't speak to anyone. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't open a book to study. He just sat in silence, because sometimes it's in silence that God begins to answer. Dr. Jonathan Blake was known for his intellectual coldness. His books were used in universities around the world. In debates, he was nearly unbeatable. His lectures were praised as pure demonstrations of applied logic. But in front of that stunned audience, the sharp-minded man felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, genuine discomfort. He tried to keep his composure. He continued lecturing, with a controlled voice and firm posture, but there was something different in his expression. The arrogant gleam that usually accompanied every word of his was gone. In its place, a restless gaze, betraying the storm forming inside him. It wasn't Youssef's question itself that had shaken him. It was what it represented. The boy didn't argue, didn't debate, didn't show disrespect. He simply asked, with a purity that escaped the rules of the intellectual game, and that made Blake vulnerable in a way no theologian, philosopher, or scholar ever had. Inside, Dr. Blake was reliving buried memories. Images of his childhood in Yorkshire appeared like involuntary flashes. His grandmother praying at the bedside, his mother reading passages from the Gospel before sleep, his father walking with him through the trees and saying, "Not everything needs to be explained, John. Some things just are." Memories he had chosen to erase, and that now returned with force, awakened not by a sermon, but by an innocent question. If no one has ever seen their own brain, why do they believe it exists? A question that, in any other context, could have been easily dismissed. But there, coming from a 6-year-old boy, it became undeniable. Because it didn't seek to win a debate, it sought to expose the limit of human arrogance. Dr. Blake felt the sweat trickle discreetly down the back of his neck. He noticed the audience no longer looked at him with admiration, but with an uncomfortable curiosity. He tried to regain control, raised his voice, dropped names, cited theories, but it was as if no one was really listening anymore. The lecture ended earlier than scheduled. He gave thanks, smiled artificially, gathered his papers, and left in silence. He didn't take questions. He didn't take photos. He didn't sign books. That night, back in his London apartment, he couldn't sleep. He sat in the leather armchair in his study, turned on the lamp and stared into space. For the first time in years, he didn't open a book. He didn't jot down ideas. He didn't plan his next talk. He just sat there, in silence. Because maybe, just maybe, the faith he had spent a lifetime ignoring had found a crack inside him, and it had the name of a Muslim child called Youssef. The lecture had ended, but no one stood up. The auditorium at the University of Cambridge, known for its intellectual buzz and heated debates, was now immersed in an almost reverent silence. It was as if each person present was trying to make sense of what had just happened, not to the scientist, but to themselves. A PhD student in neuroscience, who had spent the last 3 years studying the origin of consciousness, stared intently at the chair where Youssef had been sitting. He couldn't stop replaying the boy's question in his mind. If no one has ever seen their own brain, why do they believe it exists? It was a simple analogy, even childish, but he knew it went far beyond logic. It was an invitation to humility. Some chuckled nervously. Others shook their heads in silence. Among the guest professors, an Indian woman from the chair of philosophy of religion removed her glasses and quietly wiped her eyes. She, who had spent years trying to explain the coexistence of faith and reason in academic circles, had just watched a 6-year-old child do it with a single question. Youssef was no longer there. His father, a visiting professor from the University of Istanbul, had taken him home right after he spoke, but the trace he left remained alive among those present. Like a subtle fragrance lingering in the air after someone has gone, some students began to talk in hushed voices. Not to defend Blake or attack Youssef, but to understand. A third-year philosophy student murmured, "Logic can win argument, but faith wins silences." A young Arab exchange student typed on her phone, describing what she had just witnessed in real time to her mother in Kuwait. She wrote, "Mama, today a child taught us more about God than any professor ever could." Social media began to buzz. A short video, recorded by one of the students, was already circulating in private student groups. The title, "The Day Cambridge Stopped to Listen to a 6-Year-Old Boy." The episode became a topic in the cafeteria, the libraries, the hallways, but not as a controversy, rather as a milestone, a moment that stood out, something unlikely to repeat. Because that day, the students hadn't just attended a lecture. They had witnessed a divine reminder that there is wisdom hidden in what the world considers too small to be heard, and that reminder had the voice of a child. The auditorium doors had barely closed, and the impact of that moment was already beginning to ripple beyond the walls of Cambridge. What for many might have been just another lecture had turned into a turning point. And the story of a 6-year-old Muslim boy was beginning to echo far beyond the room where it all happened. The video recorded by a student, just 57 seconds of footage, with imperfect audio and a shaky image, was posted on social media that same afternoon. In less than 24 hours it had surpassed 2 million views, and with that came the comments, thousands of them. Some called Youssef the little sage, others a young prophet. Many shared the video with captions like, "Faith explained in a single sentence." When God uses the small to confound the great. Online newspapers in the UK began reporting on the case, at first with skepticism, trying to reduce it to a curious moment. But as more students confirmed the event and new videos surfaced from different angles, the media was forced to admit something extraordinary had happened there. In the Muslim world, the video spread like wildfire. Islamic influencers shared the scene, claiming it was proof that Allah can use even a child to exalt His truth. Sheikhs, scholars, and religious leaders commented with reverence, praising the wisdom and purity of that young boy. A mosque in Pakistan used the clip in a Friday sermon. An Islamic school in Dubai showed the video in every classroom as an example of living faith. Even a well-known Christian author referenced the event in a lecture, saying, "Perhaps the faith that moves mountains began like this, with an honest question and a clean soul." But as expected, there was also resistance. Some atheist professors tried to discredit the event, claiming emotion had clouded reason. They accused the audience of romanticizing childish ignorance. Yet even among skeptics, some admitted Youssef's firmness was rare, and Dr. Blake's silence was no accident. The story kept spreading, taking on versions, interpretations, and even memes, but the core remained: a boy, a question, and a giant of science who, on that day, had no answer. Youssef returned to his routine. His father avoided interviews. Quietly, the family went back to Turkey. But Cambridge was never quite the same. And in many parts of the world, children began asking the same question, not to win arguments, but to remind adults that faith doesn't need to be defended. It only needs to be lived with sincerity. Dr. Jonathan Blake disappeared from the spotlight for nearly 3 weeks. A man used to packed auditoriums, televised debates, and international invitations from prestigious universities simply vanished. No new articles, no lectures, no updates on his personal page. At first, colleagues assumed it was a strategic pause, maybe an academic retreat or unannounced vacation, but something was different. Those close to him noticed the change. The university secretary said he had cancelled a BBC interview at the last minute, something unthinkable for someone so disciplined, and when he finally returned to campus, it wasn't the same. He walked alone now, without the usual group of admiring students. His steps were slower, his gaze heavier. For the first time, his eyes avoided contact with the world around him, as if carrying a weight no diploma could lift. In the first class after his return, the students were tense. They expected doubled-down arrogance, ironic remarks, or even an apology, but none of that happened. Dr. Blake entered the room, looked at the young faces before him, and said, "Before we begin, I want to say that not everything can be answered with formulas. Not everything invisible is false, and sometimes the simplest questions bring us face to face with truths we've spent our lives avoiding." The room fell silent, and then, without mentioning Youssef's name or directly referring to the incident, he continued the lesson. But the tone had changed. Something inside him had been touched, and that change could no longer be hidden. The following week, he was seen visiting the university's small religious library, a place he had once mocked in an interview 2 years earlier. Days later, he discreetly attended a conference on faith and science. He didn't speak, he just listened. At an informal dinner with colleagues from the department, a Christian professor asked him, "Jonathan, are you okay?" He simply replied, "I'm not sure yet, but I'm starting to ask the right questions." Rumors began to circulate. Some said he had secretly converted. Others claimed he was just going through an existential crisis, but no one really knew. What everyone could tell was that something inside him had broken, and from that fracture, something new was emerging. Dr. Blake kept teaching, he kept writing, but now he spoke less of certainties and more of possibilities, because one day, at the height of his academic arrogance, he was disarmed by a 6-year-old boy and discovered that true wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. The story of Youssef and Dr. Jonathan Blake spread far beyond the walls of the University of Cambridge. It wasn't just another tale of faith versus reason. It was a story of transformation, of how a child, with disarming simplicity, could shake absolute convictions and shift the course of an entire room of academics, philosophers, and skeptics, and most of all, of how truth often hides in the simplest gestures. In the weeks that followed, the debate around the event reached global proportions. Media from around the world covered the story in ways that transcended academic discussion. It wasn't just scientists and philosophers commenting anymore. The public was engaged. Students from all disciplines began questioning what they once considered the undeniable certainties of modern life. On social media, videos of children and teens imitating Youssef, asking the same questions, began to appear. It was as if pure curiosity had spread like wildfire through the younger generations. The impact was immediate and profound. Faith, once pushed to the background in universities, began to be recognized as a legitimate force in the pursuit of knowledge. Not blind faith, but a faith that challenged the boundaries of logic, a faith rooted in reason and unafraid of being questioned. Intellectuals began to realize that perhaps their search for truth was far more limited than they had imagined. On the other hand, the scientist, Dr. Blake, who for years had challenged belief and taken pride in his logical impenetrability, also began to reflect on the limits of reason. His internal crisis didn't make him lose faith in science, but it did make him question his own arrogance. One day, in a rare interview, he shared a phrase that resonated like a cry of liberation. True science doesn't fear faith, it only fears absolute certainty. But it wasn't just the academic world that changed. Ordinary people, those who aren't concerned with scientific theories or academic books, began to see faith as something accessible. Youssef's questions, asked with a pure heart and a logical mind, struck a chord with thousands who perhaps had never allowed themselves to ask. Through that child, they saw that faith is not an obstacle to reason. On the contrary, it may be the key to understanding life's deepest truths. The greatest lesson, however, was for all of us: humility. Youssef, in his simplicity, disarmed one of England's greatest intellects, without raising his voice, without attacking, without rhetorical victories. He simply asked a question we should all ask ourselves every day. What do we really know, and what are we willing to learn? And the answer Youssef gave with his innocence became the truth many of us needed to hear. There is no limit to what we can understand if we keep our hearts open to wisdom that lies beyond reason. Youssef, now known as the 6-year-old boy who challenged an atheist scientist at Cambridge, returned to his simple life. He continued playing, studying the Quran with his father, running through the fields of Leicester. But something had changed forever. The impact of what happened in that auditorium never left him, and unknowingly, he had planted the seed of a profound transformation, not only in the lives of those present that day, but in thousands of people around the world. Youssef's legacy wasn't limited to that one question. He had shown the world that faith is not the enemy of reason. In fact, it is often the key to understanding the most complex and universal truths. He reminded us that sometimes answers don't come through long treatises or scientific explanations. Sometimes truth is found in a simple question, asked with an open heart and a mind free of prejudice. Youssef's story echoed for months in academic discussions, dinner tables, social media, and even in coffee shops in major cities. Scientists began to revisit their approach to the relationship between faith and reason. Young people began to question their own beliefs, unafraid to seek a truth greater than acquired knowledge. But what happened to Youssef? He grew up in an environment where faith was a force of transformation, where the simple act of questioning was seen as a way to get closer to the truth. With the support of his parents and grandparents, he continued to study, but never stopped questioning the world around him, with the same purity, courage, and intelligence with which he once challenged one of the greatest scientists in the world. If you were moved by Youssef's depth and wisdom, imagine the impact he had on future generations. He taught us that faith and reason can coexist in harmony, and that sometimes truth comes from the simplest gestures, from a young, curious mind with the power to question the world around it. If you believe this story deserves to be shared, subscribe to the channel and help us spread this powerful message. Share this video in your WhatsApp groups and on social media so that more people can witness the impact of a curious mind and unshakable faith. Together, we can inspire more Youssefs around the world and maybe, just maybe, change the way we see knowledge and truth.